Okay, so we begin with understanding some of the conceptual dimensions of Indian knowledge system before we look at translation per se. Now we come across some of these common terms when we talk about knowledge, like darshana, jnana and vidya. Right. Now we know that we have come across these terms. So we use those terms as part of our day to day intellectual discourse. Darshana, jnana, vidya. But how do we connect them? As I said, I am looking at knowledge here as a process. I am here looking at knowledge as something that is sort of it's a cumulative process, right? How do these terms become part of this process? Now, what is darshan? Darshan means like philosophy, right? Now, what exactly is philosophy? I mean, we talk about philosophy. What exactly is philosophy? That's part of it. But what exactly I want you to define what is philosophy. Philosophy is basically, as I said, a quest for knowledge, right? Now, here knowledge is essentially a vision, right? When we talk about different schools of philosophy, whether Western philosophy or Eastern philosophy, what are those? Those are different avenues, right? They signify different trajectories of obtaining knowledge. Correct? Right. How do you look at a particular phenomenon, be it the nature of existence, right? Be it the Dvaita, Vishishtadvaita, nature of existence, be it the nature of what exactly is knowledge, ontology, teleology, how so darshana signifies a kind of a method, right? Philosophy is a method of obtaining knowledge. Whether you believe in the existence of God, or you obviously the orthodox schools and the heterodox schools, they signify different ways of approximating to the idea of Godhead, right? So it's a kind of a process. Now, jnana is a medium to do so. If philosophy signifies a system, you were talking about system and polysystem in the earlier class, right? If philosophy signifies a system, right, jnana or knowledge signifies the medium which propels. Because if you believe in a philosophy, if you believe in a particular thought system, you need jnana, you need knowledge to do that. A siddha is particularly a person who is knowledgeable, who knows how to. If I say I believe in the Vedantic aesthetic of knowledge, if I say so, right, then to know how to go into that particular trajectory, I need to know about the dynamics of that knowledge system. The jnana is something that takes me forward, which propels me. It's basically that movement which takes me to that point of enlightenment. So that is jnana. And what is vidya? Vidya is that repository, that corpus of knowledge that I acquire when I use jnana to reach to my desired end. That is vidya. Now, so what happens? So if we sum it up, so philosophy leads to knowledge, right? Philosophy, therefore, darshana leads to jnana, then to vidya. So knowledge systematized is called learning or discipline. This is how I define vidya. Systematic learning is vidya. You cannot acquire vidya in one day, right? I mean, you can learn about a particular facet in one day, but you cannot acquire vidya in one day, right? You have to go through a particular ritual. You have to go through a particular system. This is a systematized acquisition. It's part of a discipline, that is vidya. Now, as stated by Aurobindo, we Indians, born and bred in a country where jnana has been stored and accumulated since the race began, bear about in us the inherited gains of many thousands of years. Unquote. Obviously, this is Aurobindo. He talks about this trajectory of knowledge. And here, Aurobindo is talking about not knowledge as an individual enterprise, but knowledge is something which is stored or which is accumulated through the collective consciousness of the people, something that is accumulated in the collective knowledge system. It's not about me and a particular or you, but it's about us. as a community, us also, like across generations, how we have transmitted. I will also try to argue how that also involves a lot of translation and interpretation when knowledge is transmitted across generations, right? When translation is transmitted across, when a particular knowledge is transmitted across generation, there is a very subtle process of translation that happens. We'll see how that happens. So there is therefore a linearity which is present here, and this is something which is posited vis-a-vis the colonial epistemology, right? So what happens when we talk about Indian knowledge system? There is a major turning point which happens with the onset of colonialism. We know that, right? That's a common narrative, that how colonialism brings about an important rupture. If I use the Derridian term, there's a rupture that is caused by colonialism. So what exactly is that rupture, right? What happens to the Indian pattern of thought, which has been supposedly going on for many thousands of years, when it comes face to face with the colonial knowledge, colonial forms of knowledge? What is the rupture that happens? So this is also something that, and it also has an impact on how translation began to be seen as a process, right? We will see, we'll sort of look at these things as part of this presentation. I'm just sort of putting my cards in front of you, so we'll pick them up by and by. So then we move to the varied manifestations of knowledge, right? What are the different terms of knowledge? One is external and internal, that is Barhimukhi and Antarmukhi. If I have to use the Sanskrit terms, like knowledge which is outwards, knowledge of the external world, right? And knowledge inward, knowledge that is spiritual, knowledge that is turned inwards, right? This is the two sort of kinds of knowledge. Then knowledge as oral, knowledge stored in text by means of scriptal knowledge, and knowledge which is transmitted through the body or transmitted through some tangible entity, like this, which is called embodied knowledge. For example, knowledge as oral, for example, the whole knowledge transmitted through the Shruti Smriti Parampara, right? That's oral knowledge. The Shruti Smriti Parampara is primarily, it's oral, right? The Vedic knowledge is oral, even though Vedas are codified, but the Vedic transmission is primarily oral, because that's why we talk about Vedic chanting, right? Nobody say Vedic, I mean, we talk about chanting of the Vedas. What is chanting? Chanting basically is an oral exercise, right? Then scriptal is basically Shastraic knowledge, knowledge inscribed in different Shastras, right, which have to be deciphered, right, in different Shastras, medicinal Shastras, like for example, Kama Sutra, but these are scripted, the knowledge which are written down, right, and which are preserved, right. Obviously there are interfaces, and then knowledge which is conveyed through the body, for example, the folk knowledge, for example, right, the folk knowledge, where a generation dresses up, or a community has particular modes of ornamentation, right, a community has particular ways of dressing, a community, a people inhabiting a community has a particular way of going about their day-to-day living, right. That knowledge is inscribed on the body of that particular human being, or that particular members of the community. So knowledge here is embodied, or knowledge represented through performance, right. Now obviously, I mean, if we look at folk performances, right, I mean, the way they dress up, the headgears that they wear, the ornaments that they wear, the tattooing that they do on their bodies, right, the piercings and all sorts of things that they do to their body. I mean, there is essentially some kind of a text, there's some message, there's some kind of a message that is conveyed, some kind of knowledge which is inscribed on their bodies, which only a person who has lived with that community for a considerable period of time, who has seen maybe members of that community maturing through like birth, marriage and death, they would know, okay, this community believes in this particular knowledge system, right? Therefore that particular knowledge or that particular symbolism is signified through particular marks on their body or something which are tangible manifestations. That's why I call embodied, those are embodied knowledge. So oral, scriptal and these are embodied knowledge, right? So knowledge could be like that. And then if we begin one by one, oral cultures, right, as the repository of traditional knowledge, knowledge as simultaneous and knowledge as simultaneous and non-simultaneous or sequential. The knowledge could be simultaneous, the knowledge could be, see, one acquires knowledge through a kind of a linear argument, and knowledge could also be acquired through dialectical modes. We'll come to that. Now, I'm again presenting a quote by Kapil Kapoor. He says, the oral texts are highly structured. I mean, see, when we talk about orality, often we wonder, right, how do they maintain such precision of arguments, right? Because when we talk about text which has inscribed, we know there is particular something that is written down. There is always this record of what has gone by, what are we presently reading, or what is there to come. So there is a sense of a presence, and Derrida talked about in the presence. He talked about presence, right? On the other hand, orality, right? Now, orality apparently, it's not like you can go back to the exact moment in the past when something was being uttered, right? While reading, we can always go back few pages and see, okay, this is what was being written down. But if you ask me, sir, could you exactly repeat what you said 10 seconds ago? Will I be able to do that? You sir, can you tell me? I have students who used to ask me, sir, could you tell me what you told yesterday, about this? I said, I have to remember what I said, right? So obviously that's because I am going in a particular flow. But does that mean orality has no structure? No. I have been speaking, I am not a trained speaker, so I am speaking in a particular flow. But if you look at orality as a trained orator, right, who follows a particular text, will be able to tell you, right? So as it says that the oral texts are highly structured, the Indian mind is acutely taxonomic. Taxonomic as in like there is highly able to classify and clarify knowledge, being it has a very highly subtly discerning mind. Okay. And the layered structure of text reflects the structured analysis of the domain of knowledge. This layered structure, there are different hierarchies of knowledge. When you move from one point to another, it signifies how you transition, how you move from one domain of knowledge to another. Now keep the idea of translation here, okay? Because I see translation as a mediating link, translation as a connecting link across these processes. In the oral culture of knowledge, the scholar has a library in his mind, and the speed of information processing is very high, much higher than in a scriptal mode where the information is first transferred to the mind through the senses. Now what happens? If you go into the folk domain, or not necessarily folk, if you go to the domain of say oral literary knowledge, you will see there are scholars who will have the entire Ramcharitmanas in their minds, right? They would remember everything right from beginning till the end. We have Shakespearean scholars who would remember the whole play like a Macbeth right from beginning to the end. They will remember, they will be able to tell you, right from from the beginning, right from the meeting of the three witches till the last speech, right? So how that happens? So it's so unlike texts where there is an external reference point. When knowledge is stored in the scripted domain, when there is a shastra that you have to refer to, you need, your mind, your senses to access the text. I need to see, I need to read. Here just try to understand the subtle difference. Knowledge acquired through orality, knowledge acquired through the written mode. When I am acquiring knowledge which is stored in an external domain like a manuscript, right? I don't remember it, but that is a referential knowledge, knowledge which is stored in a particular Shastra, right? So I have to access that Shastra to acquire the knowledge, correct? Now, how do I do that? I have to read, and when I read, I need to use my eyes, my mind, right? Maybe when I read them, my voice, right? So you need some external agency to enable access, to facilitate my access to the text which is scripted. But if some text is stored in my mind, right? So this is something where I have direct access to that particular, because that's something stored in my mind, right? So that is a very deeply cognitive process. I just need to process the information within. It's just like remembering and reading. Just like remembering and reading. If I ask you to remember something and tell me, you don't need to go anywhere else. You can scan the memory in your brain and tell me, sir, this is what you had told me. But if I ask you, look into your copy and tell me, then you have to again flip the pages and get back to me. So why I am stating this example is how, our accessibility to knowledge also defines our understanding of it, right? And how these processes are connected with translation. Because as I said, I see translation as a highly cognitive process. It's something that the process actually starts in your brain, even before you put it on paper. Even if you put the first jot down and the first the ink it on the paper, the activity should happen in your mind. Something that presently the machine is doing or the AI is doing. Once upon a time, our mind used to do that. What AI is doing now, giving you results in 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Once upon our mind used to do that. Right, that's why it's called artificial intelligence. Right, it's not human intelligence, it's derived from natural intelligence. Right, so our mind used to do that. So this is how orality was conceptualized as a knowledge system. Right, so as I talked about that moment in the 19th century when colonialism brought about a major transformation in the way we talked about knowledge, we talked about civilization, right? Till there is already a long-standing indigenous tradition of translation, of knowledge, transmission and transition activity. Now, if we put these tellings, now if we look at, say, I would like to give an example from, as I talked about the Ramayana, right? So if we look at translation as a process in the pre-colonial period, now in the pre-colonial period, right, translation was not what used to be now. Translation, as I said, was part of something that I would call the tradition of retelling. Jacobson, right, he talks about the three modes of translation. He talks about intralinguistic, interlinguistic and intersemiotic. Now, what are those three types of translation, right? So, what is intralingual? It's something when that translation happens within the same language, correct? Within the same language. How does that happen, right? So, within the same language, you have something written down. For example, we have modern English renditions of the Shakespearean play. So, we have a Shakespearean play written in 16th, 17th century English, and then we have a modern rendition, right, which is in the modern English, right. So, it's happening within the same language, or rather that story is being retold in modern English, right, using terminologies which are current in present day. Similarly, for other language, for example, if I say in Assamese, so we have like if we refer to a play by Shankardev, which is in Onkia Nadba in Brajavali, right? I mean, one could have parallel modern Assamese, renditions of what was being said in that particular language, right? So, this is happening within one linguistic culture, or this is happening within a one linguistic structure. Interlingual is fine, something that we understand translation to be generally as, and then intersemiotic is something where translation happens across mediums. Semiotic, the semiotics basically means the study of sign systems, right? Whether it's a text, whether it's orality or text or performance, essentially everything could be reduced to signs, right? Whatever we read, whatever we say, whatever we do, it could be reduced to some codified symbols which acquire meaning across and over a period of time within different cultures. So, intersemiotic, like when a particular narrative, right, say the birth of Venus, as we see in the Western pictorial tradition, visual art is represented through a painting, right? A painting is not a moving image, it's an inscribed narrative, whereas the text is a moving narrative, right? So, the painting as an inscribed narrative, it tells a story, even though it doesn't move. So, how the same narrative could be, for example, nearer home, if we visit some, say, Vaishnavite monastery like a Hotra, where we see the narratives from the life of Krishna inscribed on the panels, right? They are inscribed, they don't move, but they tell a story. So, that is an intersemiotic translation. From the text, the narrative is transferred to the images, and it's a mental text, a visual text. The moment we see that image, right, we know what happened before, we know what happened after. So, our mind can connect those series of images. Our mind will do that, right? So, that's why it is called an intersemiotic translation. So, and the very use of the word trance, trance always means a sense of going beyond. Yes, a going beyond, right? So, before the arrival of English on the back of colonialism with its own traditions of genres and other expressive forms, Indian linguistic culture is constituted by Sheldon Pollock, called the cosmopolitan vernaculars, languages which enable the localization of the globalizing literary cultural practices and representation of Sanskrit. Now, when we talk about knowledge system, as I said, the knowledge system is variously, defined as the indigenous knowledge system or the Sanskrit knowledge system, right? So, if we look at the particular, scenario in India, right, the Shastraic tradition was primarily, or the classical or the Shastraic tradition was basically conveyed, it began with Sanskrit, right? If we are not talking about folk cultures for the moment, if we talk about the scriptal knowledge, remember I talked about oral, scripted and embodied knowledge. If we talked about scripted knowledge, right, it began with Sanskrit, right, and it's only later, at the beginning of the second millennium CE, when there was a process of knowledge creation in the vernacular languages, like in our, which roughly corresponds to the beginning of the new Indo-Aryan. We have the three linguistic divisions, the OIA, Old Indo-Aryan, Middle Indo-Aryan, New Indo-Aryan, to the later stages of the MIA, which is called the Apabhramsha age, right? It's around that period of time when we have texts coming up in the vernacular or the Deshi Bhashas, right? Maybe that started somewhere around the 11th, 12th century in some languages, right? Not taking into account the South Indian languages, because in South Indian languages started much earlier. And also it could have, and the process, even in some languages, the process started as late as 17th, 18th century, right? So, there is a mapping you can do. If you look at the trajectory of Indian languages, you can actually do a mapping, right? That in which language, what process started at during which century, right? Across languages, you can actually do a kind of a mapping. So, cosmopolitan vernaculars were those Desi Bhashas which had an early exposure to the Sanskritization process. say Hindavi, right, or say Marathi, right. Among the northeast we can talk about Assamese and Manipuri, right, Uriya, right. So these languages had an early exposure, Bengali, right. These languages had an early exposure to the, because and if you want me to prove this, maybe if we look at when were the say for example the Ramayana, when were the first Ramayanas, the Desi Ramayanas composed in these languages? If you go back, if you map it, you will be able to see. Kritivashi Ramayana was composed in the 15th century. The Assamese Ramayana was composed in a century before, in the 14th century, right. Uriya Ramayana maybe around us, maybe a century later, right. Awadhi, the Ramcharitmanas came up in 1574, mid late 16th century, right. So these are markers, and these creations, these are not translations, these are retellings. These are retellings. And why are they retellings? It's not that they necessarily felt the need to tell the story in their own language, but because all those, even though they drew from the Valmiki Ramayana, all of them were inscribed into their local knowledge systems.